I'd like to talk about something which apparently is on everybody's mind, but nobody seems to have gotten it, what is happening or what the meaning of it is correctly. Let me try to explain what the whole idea of the hostages is based on the divine plan, because everybody's got it basically all wrong. Let me explain. There's certain ideas you have to understand. Different things are ordained to happen at different times, and world events line up for that. For that world event. What is really happening today? You have to understand the demand of the events in the world today. We are in the generation now of the end of the domination of Yishmael, the Arabs. Right. That's what we are now in the generation. You see that because what Israel did to the Arabs, to Lebanon, they destroyed Lebanon and so on, with the pages and the entire event where Israel destroyed that's one. But it's not just Lebanon with the pages and so on. It's also Hamas. They basically wiped them out. And then the real key is Iran. They wiped out their air force. And then, of course, America wiped out the nuclear facilities and so on. They are a basket case. The entire situation with the Arab countries that were warring with Israel. So what you see, and you clearly see, this is a divine assistance that the Arabs are on the way out militarily and so on. So therefore you see that according to the divine plan, they are losing influence and the ability to harass Israel. This is what's happening. And it's being done miraculously. It's almost like Israel doesn't fail. So the question is, when that happens, especially as we approach the Messianic era, because that's really what it means. The last, what's called Kripa, or the last enemy of the Jews, basically, is Ishmael, Arabs. Their nations. They are the last enemies of the Jews. And their reign ends at the end of time. And this is what we're seeing, you see. That's very important to understand. Now, when that happens, this is not simple. Since we now see, you have to understand and look at what is happening to the Arab nations and realize that what I said is the key to the whole puzzle. But there's something wrong or has to be corrected when this happens. They have legitimate complaints against the Jews. It's not that we did everything correctly. There are complaints that have to be compensated in favor of the Arabs, because they have whatever is on the table since Yishmael and Yitzchak. It's a long time ago. And they have a certain reckoning that they say that the Jews did what is wrong to them. Whatever it is, I mean, that's, we're talking about since Yitzchak, we're looking at 4,000 years that they have, complaints, justifiably, apparently, that we did to them, which wasn't right. So they demand compensation in heaven, and justice is justice. So therefore, what a God must do is allow them domination to justify their complaints. There's a cheshbon, there's a reckoning that will be recognized at the end of time. Well, but so therefore, what is God going to do? Well, the Zohar gives the key. The Zohar, I think it's in Parshas Va'era, okay, or and so on, says that Israel will be under the domination of the Arabs at the end of time. I think it says 9 months or whatever. Therefore, that means, and the reason for that is that Israel has to compensate the Arabs for what we did wrong to them over the 4,000 years. Okay, and they have their own reckoning where they will stand in terms of world dominion and so on, without getting into the history of the Arabs. But they have to compensate the Jewish people for what the Jews wronged them, Yishmael, and so on, without getting into that. And the Zohar says that we will be under their domination, right, for a long 9 months, but it's really much longer. And that gives them legitimacy, you see, to dominate us. But as we approach the Messianic era, God must accelerate the process. This is the problem. Therefore, the hostages now become the solution. As far as I'm concerned, you don't realize that the hostages are in the hands of the Arabs. And it's not just 250 people. The hostage pains the Jewish people all over the world. In many ways, which is very interesting, God chose 250 people as what he calls volunteers to represent the ability of the Arab people to dominate the Jews and to enslave and pain the Jews, all the Jews basically, throughout the world and so on. And these hostages don't realize that their reward for, not that they were agreeing, but they will be compensated infinitely reward for allowing God to use them to, where the Arabs can state, okay, we have deserved victory. You see, okay, we're being compensated by allowing us to pain the Jews throughout the world. They will be rewarded for this. In fact, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, this is based on what he says, that in the end of time, there's a certain atmosphere or climate that must happen negatively, because in the end of time, what happens is what's called Tigboya Sarah, the growth of evil sets the climate for the world, with the world events and so on. But in order to make that happen, righteous people have to suffer. You see, in order to compensate people that claim that they've been wronged by Jewish people or whatever, God has to settle the score. And many times settling the score against the Jews, this has to happen. And that's why But the people who are suffering suffer, and they are actually chosen as volunteers. Not that they volunteered, but God chooses them to be worthy, basically, worthy to be chosen to compensate the claim of justice by these people, even though they're evil. Justice has to be satisfied. This is the problem. Even if it means people, righteous people, have to suffer to allow evil to grow. This is the way, in many ways, justice is satisfied. Now, especially since we're very close to the Messianic age, it's got to be done now. There is no time. So the claims that the Arabs have against the Jews throughout history, and I'm sure there are many claims that only God knows where the Jews are wrong and so on. In any case, they have to be compensated. They have to be justified now, answered now. That is why these hostages were taken. But they should realize that because they were allowed to be taken to represent the claim that they have against the Jews, their reward in the Olam Haba, in the future world, will be basically infinite. Even though we don't realize that. This is the same as what's happening in many ways to righteousness today. Righteousness is losing. Many people are apikosim, which means heretics and so on, because evil has a claim throughout the ages and so on. And in order to have what's called tikbur sarah, the growth of evil, in order to allow it to exist and proliferate, to compensate it for the fact that it was also treated badly in a wrong way, and only God knows when that happens. Therefore, this is the time. As far as I'm concerned, those hostages represent the Jewish people's guilt for what they did to the Arab nations, Ishmael, for thousands of years. And only God knows the cheshbon. And the fact that it is ending basically on Hoshana Rabbah. Hoshana Rabbah is the day of judgment, the end day of judgment, shows that the whole hostage deal, the event of taking hostages and the suffering and pain that the Jews felt as a result, is justice related, or else they wouldn't be returned exactly 2 years on the day of judgment itself. You see, that's the way to look at it. And that's why it's happening on Hoshana Rabbah. Not only that, what's good is that their claim is now ended because the hostages removed their claim. You see, so their claim is now ended. So what there should be now is, since it's ending on Hoshana Rabbah and Shmini Atzeres and so on, what will happen as a result of that is, since their claim is over, the deal will end, which is amazing. And now it's going to be very good. And you see this. That's why the agreement, and part of the compensation of the claim of the Arabs is the release of more of these people. But they're no longer released, and therefore will commit evil openly against the Jews. You know, this is part of the negotiations where they survive and so on. But at least we have been released from their claim that we have done to them for thousands of years and so on, and this is a very important idea, which is what I've said and so on. Therefore, in many ways, the fact that the hostages are released is the termination of their claim against us. And this is part of the termination of the dominion of the Arabs, which the Zohar says. And now you understand why. Justice has to be done. This is a very important idea. Even it has to be compensated to evil people because they have a claim. What was done to them was also not just, was wrong, and they deserve to be compensated by righteous people. And this is it. That's what the hostages are really all about. To remove the claim of the Ishmael Arabs of what the Jews did to them for 4,000 years. And only God knows what that involves and so on. But they should realize that their reward for being chosen, we don't know why they were chosen and so on, but their reward for being chosen is basically infinite. Just like all the righteous people who are suffering either through sickness, divorce, poverty, all of this occurs many times to people that don't deserve this to them because they didn't do anything to justify this. But the reason why they have to go through it is because this is the claim that evil has against righteousness, right? And God has to use this to level the justice claim of what goes on, because God is a very exacting, just being. And if evil is done, it has to be undone. This is the problem. So this hostage event, which was terrible for 2 years, is part of the divine plan to remove the weight of error against the Jews and to continue the Messianic process. Because you can see it's all justice related. It either happens in days of judgment, right? That's when it happens, and so on. And it makes no sense. The logic makes no sense. But remember, it's not being governed by man, really. It's governed by the necessities of the divine plan. So really, in the end, this is all Tigber Sarah, the proliferation of evil. And much of it is a compensation of what error was done to evil itself. I know it sounds weird, but you have to be, it's a tzedek tirdov. Justice, you will pursue, even when the claimant is evil itself. Everything has to be right in the end, and all evil has to be undone, even evil that was done to evil wrongly. This is basically what's going on. So do not wonder. This is what's happening. Thank you.